science in historic conservation, and he has had a lot of international experience. So we look forward to your talk, which is about chasing authenticity.
Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, James and Roxandra, for organising these two splendid days and the opportunity to explore this extraordinary concept of authenticity. I have been amazed by the number of ideas and concepts that have come across in the last 2 hours, which have made it through the incredibly thick cold that surrounds my head at the moment. So if I speak through my nose, please forgive me. But I will try and put forward in moderately clear terms some thoughts and ideas about authenticity in a British context. Now, there it is. So, what we're going to do is try and chase down this concept of authenticity a little bit in a British context. When I spoke to my colleagues and said I was going to give a talk on authenticity, one of them said, "That's easy. This is an Italian colleague, far less squeamish about the concept than we are here in the UK." And I've given it a subtitle about worshipping at the temple rather than worshipping the temple. We spend a lot of time worshipping individual items, individual elements, rather than actually thinking about the larger picture of what we're dealing with. And it gets us into all sorts of problems. And here are our main culprits. Beautiful photographs of beautiful men with beautiful thoughts who have led us into a direction for many, many years, and I would say have scarred our psyche when it comes to dealing with authenticity. Messrs. Morris and Ruskin, intricately linked through their thinking, brilliant discourse, but people who are following ideas for many, many years of a long line of thought, and whose influence has stunted the development of authenticity in the UK. It has left us 100 years of a concept stuck roughly in the same place, in spite of the glorious efforts of the likes of our maestro here, who has come in from abroad and given us thoughts internationally about what authenticity means, and of our old friend, the late Herb Stovall, as well. So, where do Morris and Ruskin lead us? Well, into Ruskin's 7 lamps of architecture, and particularly those 2 lamps, truth and memory. It's a brilliant, brilliant essay, and it's wonderful to read it, it's refreshing to read it. But truth, details and construction, and memory respecting the past, these are 2 things that continue to haunt us. We take them so heavily and so seriously, to the point that I read a letter lately about something within this image. Not the beautiful Norman church replacing the much earlier Byzantine round church. Basically, the penchant for such things, round churches in Byzantium, are a glorious thing to chase down. Not the worshippers going around the holy point. It's an image which is not well known to us here. We're probably more familiar with the image of the Kaaba and the circulation of that at the Hajj, not this most holy of shrines within Christendom. The discussion in a letter to the Spabs, wonderful cornerstone, was about the scaffolding erected around the chapel in the 1920s. Somebody seriously suggesting this itself should be preserved in situ. I think we're missing the point of it. Yes, it's part of the history of the place. Yes, it's part of the repair of the place. But actually, it's a romantic attachment to the sacredness of material, which I think is overdone. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from, before Ruskin, it comes actually from Turner, but here's Gandhi. Gandhi, that amazing artist, introducing a new building here as a ruin. This is the Bank of England as designed by Soane prior to its demolition, in fact prior to its building, but built and drawn and described by Gandhi as a ruin. A picturesque ruin, no less. This notion of the picturesque, which is so strong in the UK, to the point that one of our World Heritage sites, our colleagues down at Fountains Abbey, are the embodiment of the picturesque, and that is inscribed in their World Heritage Site values. The picturesque is a glorious and wonderful thing. Indeed, it's embodied within the New Town. The New Town was designed around these principles of Rus in Urbe, the picturesque movement, as a part of the Enlightenment. And it takes us on here. This is Melrose Abbey, a different abbey nonetheless, but drawn by Turner, who, of course, Ruskin himself worshipped. Turner, a brilliant, brilliant artist, romanticising ruins. And if you have the time and the energy, it's worth delving into Christopher Woodward's book called In Ruins, in which he explores the idea of the ruin of Britain's obsession with the romance going back to the Grand Tour and beyond, and which is carried through into different concepts of heritage, particularly the idea of Drep the Death in Wales, where they look at heritage as a more intangible thing, with the buildings just the embodiment of it. Other nations are much less squeamish about authenticity than we are. Here we have Timbuktu. Aside from some recent interventions, it is an extraordinary World Heritage Site which is renewed every year. Every year that is recoated in mud. Is that authentic? Is the process of re-mudding it, which was a more technical term, is that in part the intangible heritage of the site? If you took away an element of the intangible heritage, what would happen to the tangible heritage? Where would that go? Well, it would be destroyed rapidly. So is it a question of materials we're dealing with? Or is it something else? I think it is something else. And I'm going to throw into the mix one more idea, just to really confuse you all, the idea of intention. Roxandra touched upon it. But it's something we don't really deal with. We deal with authenticity and integrity in World Heritage terms. We don't particularly touch on the intention. What did the master planner, the architect, the craftsman, what did they actually hope to achieve, or the owner, the commissioner of the work? Is that intention relevant to us today when we approach an object or even a concept? Should we respect that intention? In an Edinburgh context, this is something which is very real. But then, of course, we get values chucked into the whole thing. And again, Roxandra touched upon this. And this idea of the aesthetic, the romantic, which is stuck into our heads through the picturesque movement and through Ruskin and through existing, living ways of looking at heritage within the SPAB and others. Of course, I'm a member of the SPAB, I love them. But it creates a counterpoint, a conflict in the way in which we look at authenticity. Historical authenticity, architectural authenticity, social authenticity, and then the aesthetic, the romantic, which in themselves, in fact, become historic and architectural as well. So this leads us into dreadful conflicts, particularly in a place like Edinburgh where we know what the intentions are. So you come to repair a building. Now, if you're following the philosophies of 100 or so years ago, which we work on, we develop, we live with, these wonderful, wonderful carvings would not have been replaced. They would have been repaired. Perhaps coated over with a shelf coat of lime, built up with plastic repair, and some other technical things. Yet there we're following the architect's intention, you know what it is, it's drawn down. We're following the craftsman's intention, even though the craftsmen here were ones we had to borrow from our friends in Eastern Europe, because we were short of skills in this country to do that. We can scale that up to the somewhat larger scale of Edinburgh itself as a whole. The old and the new towns are designed. There is an intention behind them, there are codes behind them, there were things that steered the way they developed in spite of individual market circumstances, which again Roxandra touched upon. The new town we know well for its extraordinary patterns, its extraordinary structures, embodying the picturesque movement, going back to that blessed moment in time that has so touched upon our way of thinking, but also much earlier the old town as well. The old town was subject to design codes. It is not organic, the World Heritage inscription is wrong. This happens, but unfortunately is now stuck with us since 1995. Post-history, back to James, things move on, things change, concepts develop. World Heritage could be argued to have stuck us there, but it's all an artificial concept, so who cares? So here we have the old town, which was defined by very real concepts, very real ideas of design and coding and development, and of course economics as well, in terms of the width of the burgage plot and the value of what you had in terms of land facing onto the principal marketplace. So this leads us into a range of different approaches in the UK to authenticity. This is Queen Street. Queen Street was the most expensive street in the first town, facing out over the gardens, not out over the stinking bog to the smelly old town. This street has a range of interventions within it from different periods. The Georgian structure is there are Georgian buildings there are Victorian interventions, there's a 1980s intervention at the end there, which is classical, you can't quite see it, and of course a portrait gallery, something entirely at odds with the classicism of the street. It's an eclectic approach, it reflects James's idea of that sports pitch with different markings upon it, yet which can be read as one as well, and which is given life by its meaning and uses. You can follow intention. This is a scholarly and good reproduction of what might have been on Glenfinlas Street coming off Charlotte Square. Charlotte Square being one of the three principal points within the World Heritage Site of absolute beauty, that, the castle and the Holyrood. Historic and architectural importance of the highest order. That is a valid approach to that site. There is nothing wrong with doing that. That is somebody following intention. Is it authentic? In spirit? Yes. In materials? Yes. In use? Who knows? It's not designed as an office. But it is there. It doesn't do any harm to anybody. And here's one which takes the value approach. A sopping great big chunk of high Gothic with a K planted in amongst Georgian houses. This is someone having a laugh. But it's a question of approaching it from architectural values rather than other kinds of values. And here we have one which deals mill wine. This is a place of absolutely no authenticity, one might argue. But then you might say, well, hang on. Those street signs, they're all carefully designed. That's something Britain deliberately adopted in its design, and they designed the traffic light as well. And that barrier. What does that tell us about our society? What does it tell us about how we overthink things occasionally? And of course, you can see at the top right bits of Colton Hill, and on the left-hand side, the facade of a church retained and incorporated into a glass box. We can take these concepts and use them how we to guide how we approach different places. Were you to take down the Jury's Inn here, which dominates the view across the valley, how would you replace that? What would you do? Would you follow what was there? Would you follow the skyline that exists? Would you look at what was there in the past? Would you play with the crags, as the architects have tried to do in their composition? It gives us a richness of approaches, and that richness plays out in the fabric we have here, no matter how confused it may seem. Other places are less squeamish than we are. This is in Penang. This is not the worst example by a long shot of what you do with a colonial villa in its garden, sitting in the town block of the Wawasang University. This is a short one. But this is something perhaps the Vienna Charter might well get its teeth into. Coming back to Roxandra and James's and also Stephen's ideas about places, we're years behind, we're decades, we're centuries behind. The Aboriginals of Australia got there by a long way ahead of us in the way in which they look at the world, look at places, and play with authenticity. Now, we're going to talk about the subjective approach. This, of course, combines subjective, objective, spiritual, unreal. All these different worlds collide into one. And you become authentic, in my view, when you start to look at the subjective individual memories, combine them into the greater memory of a community, of a place, of a landscape. This is the landscape approach to heritage, which UNESCO is pushing forward, though not in this particular format. You then come down to something which is authentic, about the intangible values attached to place. And that's much of that you can find within the Borough Charter, extrapolated from that. And then this, for me, is authentic. Last week I took a holiday in my room. Thank you. A holiday in my room. There was a French philosopher in the 19th century who took a holiday in his room. He spent 1 week exploring his room, going around the place, observing the fly on the wall and how it moved, and other exotic things and where it took his mind. It took it to interesting places. I don't recommend the book, but still. I had a week in a room. I was repairing a room. I was restoring a room, in fact. It had been comprehensively messed around over the last 40 years, and was bringing it back to where it ought to be, where it is palimpsest of 1740s and 1840s. And here we have a floorboard. This is an authentic intervention into the house. You couldn't tell it was an intervention until you opened it up. On the bottom side of the floorboard, it was signed by Mr. Fraser and Mr. Grandison, 1921. Clearly they had been dealing with woodworm in 1921, prepared it, signed it, nailed it down, and left it there. This, to me, is the opposite of Vienna and the thoughts that come out of the Charter there, but it is certainly genuine, it's certainly authentic. Thank you.